I learned what I was worth to my father on my 21st birthday. Not in some vague, metaphorical sense that you can rationalize away over therapy sessions and self-help books. I learned it in cold, hard numbers. $900 a month. That's what he valued my presence in his Gold Coast penthouse at. Meanwhile, my brother John got a BMW 5 Series with a white bow on the hood. The crystal champagne flute caught the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows as William raised it that Tuesday evening, his silver Patek Philippe glinting against his pressed white cuff. We were standing in the dining room that overlooked Lake Michigan, the kind of view that real estate agents describe as breathtaking and once in a lifetime. My mother had gone all out with the table setting, Hermes china and Belgian linens, because that's what you do when you're pretending your family isn't rotting from the inside out. She'd even hired a private chef for the evening, some guy from Alinea who made foams and gels out of vegetables that cost more than most people's car payments. "To John," my father announced, and I watched his face transform into something I'd never seen him wear for me. Pride. Unguarded, uncomplicated pride. "You've earned this, son. Top of your class at Northwestern, president of your fraternity, internship lined up at Goldman Sachs. You're everything I knew you'd be." He turned to John, who stood there in his Brunello Cucinelli sweater looking like he'd been born for this exact moment, which, let's be honest, he had been. "The BMW's parked downstairs. Midnight blue, just like you wanted. You've made me proud." The chef had prepared some kind of deconstructed beef Wellington that probably took 6 hours to make. I'd lost my appetite around the time John started his acceptance speech, but I kept my fork moving because that's what you do at these things. You perform. You smile. You pretend the knife isn't already in your back. Then William turned to me. His expression shifted, like someone had flipped a switch behind his eyes. The pride drained out, replaced by something closer to obligation. My mother, Victoria, sat frozen at the other end of the table, her Botoxed forehead somehow managing to convey concern despite its chemical paralysis. "Jenny," he said, and even my name sounded different coming out of his mouth. Flatter. Transactional. "You're 21 now. An adult, which means it's time you started contributing to this household. Rent will be $900 a month, due the first Sunday of every month. I'll expect it in my account by noon." The room went silent except for the ambient music Victoria had selected, some kind of modern classical piece that was probably supposed to be sophisticated, but just sounded like anxiety with a cello. I set down my fork carefully, the way you handle explosives. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me. You're an adult. Adults pay their way." He cut into his beef Wellington with surgical precision. "You can use your salary from the internship at the gallery. It should be more than enough." The internship at the gallery? The unpaid internship at his friend's gallery in River North? The one he'd insisted I take instead of the paying position I'd landed at the Art Institute? The one where I spent 40 hours a week fetching coffee and writing wall texts for installations I'd never be allowed to curate, all for the privilege of building my resume and making connections. I was living off the remains of my college graduation money, watching it evaporate on Ubers and the occasional lunch that wasn't leftovers from whatever Victoria's meal service delivered. "I don't get paid at the gallery," I said slowly. "You know that. You're the one who told me to take it." "Then I suggest you figure something out. There are plenty of restaurants in Chicago looking for servers. Retail stores always need help. You're a smart girl, Jenny. I'm sure you'll manage." He took a sip of his Chateau Margaux, a bottle that cost more than 3 months of the rent he was demanding. This is how the real world works. I looked at John, who was suddenly very interested in his plate, then at Victoria, who'd developed a fascination with her wine glass. Nobody was going to say anything. Nobody was going to point out that John was 23 and had never paid a dime to live here. Nobody was going to mention that his internship at Goldman came with a $50,000 signing bonus and a guaranteed position after graduation. Why am I paying rent while John gets a BMW? The question came out steadier than I felt. I'd spent 21 years learning how to keep my voice level in this house, how to not give William the satisfaction of seeing me break. William set down his silverware with deliberate care, the kind of measured movement that meant he'd been saying something he'd been saving up. Because he's worth it. 4 words. That's all it took. 4 words delivered with the casual cruelty of someone commenting on the weather. Because he's worth it. Not because he's older or because he's graduated or even because he's a man, though we all knew that was part of it. No, he'd chosen the one phrase that made his position crystal clear. John had value. I didn't. It was that simple. Victoria made a small sound, something between a gasp and a cough, but she didn't contradict him. She never did. That was her specialty, really, the art of sitting silently while William dismantled people. She'd perfected it over 26 years of marriage. "William," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we should discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss. This is my house, my rules. Jenny's an adult now, and adults support themselves. I'm actually being generous by charging below market rate. Do you know what a room goes for in this neighborhood?" I did know. I'd looked it up once, during one of those late-night spirals where you torture yourself with real estate listings for places you'll never be able to afford. Studios in Gold Coast started at $2,500 a month. One-bedrooms were closer to $3,000. By those standards, $900 was a bargain. But that wasn't the point, and we both knew it. The point was power. The point was making sure I understood my place in the family hierarchy. The point was that John could coast through life with William's approval, while I had to justify my existence with monthly payments. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floors that Victoria had imported from some reclaimed French chateau. "I need some air." "Sit down, Jennifer. We're not done with dinner." "I think we are." I walked out of that dining room with my head up, past the Rothko in the hallway that William loved to casually mention cost mid-6 figures, past the marble foyer with its baccarat chandelier, into my bedroom with its view of the lake that I'd apparently been renting without knowing it. I pulled out the Toomey suitcase I'd gotten for high school graduation, the one with my initials monogrammed on the side, and started packing. Here's what I took. My clothes, my laptop, my books, my grandmother's pearl earrings that Victoria had tried to claim as family heirlooms even though they came from my dad's side, the emergency credit card I'd opened without telling anyone, and my dignity, which, surprisingly, still fit despite everything. Here's what I left. The Cartier watch William had given me for my 18th birthday with a card that said, "To my daughter who has so much potential," the iPhone 15 that was on the family plan, and any illusion that I mattered to these people beyond what I could provide for their image. I packed efficiently, the way you do when you've been planning your escape in the back of your mind for months without admitting it to yourself. Every piece of clothing I folded was a small act of rebellion. Every drawer I emptied was a declaration of independence. I wasn't running away. I was walking out. There's a difference. It took me 45 minutes to reduce 21 years of life to 2 suitcases. I pulled out a piece of Victoria's personalized stationery from my desk drawer, the heavy cream cardstock with her initials in raised gold lettering that she ordered from some boutique printer in London. The irony of using her expensive paper for this felt appropriate. I wrote, "Since I'm apparently not worth keeping around for free, I've decided to save you the trouble of monthly collections. Don't worry about the room. I'm sure you can convert it into whatever John needs next, maybe a trophy case. Good luck with the rent you'll never collect. Jenny." I stuck it on the Sub-Zero fridge with one of the magnets from their Italian vacation, the one they'd taken John on while I stayed behind for summer classes. Then I called an Uber, grabbed my bags, and walked out of the penthouse at 211 East Delaware Place for what I thought would be the last time. The thing about dramatic exits is that they feel amazing for about 10 minutes. Then reality sets in, usually around the time you're sitting in the back of a stranger's Honda Civic, watching your entire life disappear in the rearview mirror. The driver kept trying to make small talk about the weather, the Cubs, the construction on Lakeshore Drive. I gave him monosyllabic answers and watched the Gold Coast give way to Old Town, then Lincoln Park, then Lakeview, tracking my descent down the economic ladder in real time. I texted my best friend Melissa while I was packing. She'd moved into a 3-bedroom apartment in Logan Square with 2 other girls from Columbia, the kind of place where the kitchen was the size of a closet, but the rent was actually manageable. She'd been trying to convince me to move out for months, but I'd always made excuses. The commute to the gallery, the free food, the fact that my student loans were somehow less terrifying when I didn't have to think about them. Really, I'd just been scared. Scared of proving William right, that I couldn't make it on my own. Scared of admitting that leaving meant accepting he'd never change, never see me the way he saw John, never wake up one morning and realize he'd been wrong about me all along. As long as I stayed, there was hope. Now, there wasn't. Melissa met me at the curb with a bottle of cheap wine and a fury that could have powered the whole city. "I'm going to kill him," she announced, grabbing one of my suitcases. "I'm going to wait until he's alone in that penthouse, and I'm going to push him off the balcony." That's sweet, but I think Illinois still has laws about that. Then I'll make it look like an accident. I've watched enough Dateline. The apartment was exactly what I needed. Mismatched furniture, exposed brick, radiators that clanked dramatically, and absolutely zero pretension. Melissa's roommates, Rachel and Ashley, were watching The Bachelor in the living room and barely looked up when we came in, which I appreciated. The last thing I wanted was to explain my personal tragedy to strangers while they performed sympathy. Melissa showed me to the 3rd bedroom, which was technically a converted sunroom, but had a door and a window and was therefore legally a bedroom according to Chicago rental law. It's $450 a month, utilities included. Rachel's boyfriend basically lives here, so we figured we'd rather have someone actually paying. You can move in whenever. How about now? Perfect. I'll get the other wine. We sat on the floor of my new room because there wasn't any furniture yet, and drank Target wine out of the glasses Melissa had stolen from a bar in Wicker Park. She let me cry for exactly 10 minutes, timed on her phone, and then cut me off. Okay, mourning period over. Now we plot. Plot what? Jenny! Your father just told you to your face that you're worthless compared to your brother. On your birthday, at a dinner where he gave John a car that costs more than my entire college education. You're not seriously just going to let that go? I'd been so focused on getting out that I hadn't thought past the actual escape. Revenge hadn't even occurred to me. I just wanted to survive, to prove I could make it without William's money or approval. But the way Melissa said it, with that particular edge in her voice, made something shift in my chest. What exactly do you have in mind? I don't know yet, but your dad's a commercial real estate developer, right? And your brother's going into finance. There's gotta be something there, some leverage, some secret. She poured more wine, sloshing it slightly on the hardwood. Rich people always have secrets. It's like a requirement. She wasn't wrong. I'd grown up in that world, the one where appearances mattered more than reality, where everyone was 3 drinks away from confessing to something illegal or immoral or both. The charity galas where William held court, the country club dinners where deals got made over cigars and bourbon, the family gatherings where everyone smiled for photos and then spent the rest of the night passive-aggressively destroying each other. I'd been so busy trying to earn William's approval that I hadn't stopped to pay attention to the details, to the phone calls he took in his study with the door closed, to the way he and Victoria would stop talking when I walked into a room, to the weekends he spent at the office, even though his office was supposedly closed, to the way John had gotten into Northwestern despite a 3.2 GPA and SAT scores that were, charitably speaking, mediocre. I need to think, I said. You need to act. But first, you need to eat. Ashley made gnocchi and it's actually edible. Come on. I followed her into the kitchen, where Rachel and Ashley had already set out plates and were arguing about whether the Bachelor was genuinely interested in any of the contestants or just contractually obligated to pretend. It was so stunningly normal that I almost cried again. Nobody cared that I'd just fled my family. Nobody asked about the penthouse or the BMW or the rent that had started this whole thing. I was just Jenny, Melissa's friend who needed a room. That was enough. My phone had been buzzing in my pocket for the last hour, but I'd been ignoring it. Now, sitting at a scratched IKEA table eating homemade gnocchi that was actually pretty good, I finally looked. 43 missed calls, 67 text messages, 3 voicemails. The calls were all from William. The texts were split between John, Victoria, and various family friends who'd apparently been activated like sleeper agents. The voicemails were all from my father, and I could tell without listening that he'd progressed from anger to what he probably thought was reason, but was actually just more anger with better vocabulary. "He's losing his mind," I said, scrolling through the messages. "John's panicking, my mom's screaming at both of them, and my dad's calling everyone we've ever met." Melissa looked at my phone, then at me, and smiled. "Good. Let him panic. Let them all panic. You've spent your whole life trying to make them happy. Maybe it's time they try making you happy for once." But that wasn't quite right. I didn't want them to make me happy. I wanted them to understand what they'd done. I wanted William to wake up one morning and realize that the casual cruelty he'd dispensed over beef Wellington had cost him something. I wanted John to feel a fraction of the doubt I'd lived with my entire life. I wanted Victoria to stop hiding behind her wine glass and her charity boards and actually take a stand for once. I wanted justice, I realized. Not revenge, exactly. Justice. And then, sitting in that tiny kitchen in Logan Square with wine-drunk friends I barely knew and gnocchi that cost about $3 to make, I finally remembered something. A conversation I'd overheard 6 months ago, late at night when I'd come home early from a gallery opening that had been insufferably boring. William had been in his study with someone I didn't recognize, and they'd been talking about permits and zoning and something about Pilsen that didn't make sense. At the time, I'd dismissed it. Real estate was William's business. He was always working on something. But now, with distance and wine and motivation, I remembered the other part. The part where the stranger had said, "As long as the inspection happens on schedule, nobody needs to know the foundation is compromised. By the time anyone notices, we'll have flipped it to the next developer." And William had laughed. Actually laughed. I grabbed my laptop from my bag and opened it on the kitchen table. "Melissa, how do you feel about a little research project?" "I feel great about it. What are we researching?" "Everything we can find about my father's company, his properties, his permits, his partners, all of it. Because if William wanted to treat me like an adult who had to pay her own way in the world, then I was going to act like one. And adults, I was learning, didn't just run away from problems. They gathered information. They made plans. They found leverage. They took back their power, one carefully documented piece of evidence at a time." My phone buzzed again. Another call from William. I watched it ring, watched his name flash on the screen, and then I did something I'd never done before. I declined the call. Then I blocked his number. "What'd you just do?" Melissa asked. "I'm not sure yet, but I think I just started something I can't take back." Rachel looked up from her pasta. "Good for you. That's the most alive you've looked since you got here." She was right. I felt awake for the first time in years, terrified and uncertain and possibly making the biggest mistake of my life, but awake. The question wasn't whether I was going to dig into William's business. The question was what I'd find when I did and what I'd do with it once I had it. But first, I had another call to make. I unblocked William's number long enough to send him a single text. "Tell John his car looks great. Hope he enjoys it. I'm sure he earned it somehow." Then I blocked him again and poured myself more wine. Whatever came next, at least I'd be facing it on my own terms. The thing about wealthy families is that they're not actually good at keeping secrets. They're just good at surrounding themselves with people who have incentives not to look too closely. Take away those incentives, and the whole structure starts to crumble surprisingly fast. William had spent 21 years assuming my loyalty was guaranteed because I was his daughter. He'd forgotten that loyalty is a two-way street, and he'd just set his half on fire. I woke up on my first morning in Logan Square to the smell of burnt toast and the sound of Rachel singing off-key in the shower. My sunroom bedroom was freezing because the radiator worked on some mysterious schedule known only to the building's ancient boiler system. I'd slept in my clothes on an air mattress Melissa had dug out of storage, and my neck felt like someone had spent the night practicing origami with my spine. It was perfect. My phone had 17 new messages from numbers I didn't recognize. William had apparently mobilized his entire contact list. His business partner, Richard, wanted to chat. His lawyer, Stuart, thought we should have a conversation about this misunderstanding. Even Victoria's sister, Catherine, who I hadn't heard from in 3 years, suddenly wanted to check in. The subtext was clear. Come back, shut up, pretend this never happened. I deleted them all and opened my laptop instead. At 3 in the morning, fueled by wine and righteous anger, I'd started building a spreadsheet. Now, in the harsh light of a November morning, it looked less like a plan and more like the conspiracy board of someone who'd watched too many true crime documentaries. But there was something there. I could feel it. William's company, Dalton Development Group, had been operating in Chicago for 32 years. On the surface, everything looked legitimate. High-end residential properties, commercial buildings, the occasional mixed-use development that got written up in architecture magazines. He served on the boards of 3 different charities, donated generously to Northwestern and the Art Institute, and had a Wikipedia page that called him a visionary in urban development. The man knew how to build a reputation. But reputations are just stories people agree to believe, and I was no longer in the business of agreeing with William about anything. I started with public records. Cook County's property database was surprisingly accessible once you figured out the search interface, which took me about 2 hours and 4 cups of Melissa's industrial-strength coffee. I pulled up every property Dalton Development had purchased, sold, or developed in the last 5 years. 23 buildings total, concentrated in neighborhoods that were either already gentrified or in the process of getting there. Wicker Park, Logan Square, Pilsen, Bronzeville. The pattern was predictable. Buy low in transitional neighborhoods, develop quickly, sell high to the next wave of buyers who wanted to live somewhere authentic, but not too authentic. What was less predictable were the shell companies. I found them by accident, really, following a trail of LLC names that kept appearing in the property records. Dalton Development would buy a property, then immediately transfer it to something called LSD Holdings, or Michigan Properties LLC, or Delaware Street Investments. Then, 6 months later, the property would transfer back to Dalton Development, but now it was worth 3 times as much on paper. After that, the building would get developed and flipped to the actual end buyer. I'm not a real estate lawyer, but even I could smell something off about that pattern. Why the shell companies? Why the rapid transfers? And why did all the properties seem to appreciate dramatically during the brief period they weren't technically owned by Dalton Development? I called Melissa into my room. She appeared wearing pajamas covered in cartoon sloths and holding a bowl of cereal. What's up? You find something? Maybe. Look at this. I turned my laptop around and showed her the spreadsheet I'd been building. Every property goes through this weird shuffle. Dalton buys it, transfers it to a shell company, the value magically increases, it comes back to Dalton, then gets developed. Why would he do that? Melissa squinted at the screen. Tax thing? That's what I thought at first, but the transfers are happening too fast. Illinois has a look-back period for property assessments. If you're trying to game the system for tax purposes, you'd space things out more. This is something else. Okay, so what is it? I have no idea, but I know someone who might. I pulled out my laptop and opened my email. Scrolling back through 2 years of messages, I found what I was looking for, an email from Professor Sarah Chen, who'd taught my real estate law class junior year. She was a former prosecutor who'd left the state's attorney's office to teach at DePaul, and she'd made a point of telling us that if we ever encountered something that smelled wrong in the real estate world, we should bring it to her attention. At the time, I thought she was just being dramatic. Now, I was counting on it. I wrote carefully, explaining that I was doing research on property development patterns in Chicago and had noticed some unusual transfer sequences that I didn't understand. Could she take a look? I attached my spreadsheet and hit send before I could second-guess myself. Her response came back in 40 minutes. "This is interesting. Can you come to my office this afternoon, 2 p.m.?" Professor Chen's office at DePaul was exactly how I remembered it. Crammed with books, smelling faintly of green tea, covered in Post-it notes, with what appeared to be case citations written in red Sharpie. She'd aged a bit since I'd taken her class, more gray in her hair, but her eyes had that same sharp quality, like she was constantly 3 steps ahead of whatever you were about to say. "Jenny Dalton," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I wondered if I'd hear from you again. Last I checked, you were supposed to be at some internship your father set up." Things changed. I'll say, I did some digging after you emailed. Your father's company is all over these transactions. You understand what you're implying here. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking questions. She smiled at that. "Good answer. Okay, let's talk about what you found. These shell companies, they're not unusual by themselves. Developers use them all the time for liability protection, privacy, tax optimization. But the pattern you've identified is suspicious. The rapid transfers, the value appreciation during the intermediate ownership period, the fact that it happens with almost every property, that suggests something called assessment fraud, which is artificially inflating the assessed value of a property between purchase and development. There are a couple ways to do it. You can submit fraudulent comps to the assessor's office, showing that similar properties in the area sold for more than they actually did. You can make cosmetic improvements that look good on paper but don't actually change the property's fundamental value. Or you can just have friends in the assessor's office who are willing to sign off on whatever numbers you submit. The coffee I drunk earlier turned to acid in my stomach. Why would someone do that? Money. If you can artificially inflate the property's value before you develop it, you can borrow more against it. Higher assessed value means bigger loans. Then you develop the property, sell it for market rate, pay back the inflated loan, and pocket the difference. It's a form of bank fraud, basically. You're getting loans based on false valuations. But the banks would notice, wouldn't they? You'd think, but if the paperwork looks legitimate, if the comps seem reasonable, if the assessments are coming from the official county office, why would they look closer? Banks approve thousands of loans a month. They're not investigating every single one. They're trusting the system. And if someone's gaming the system at the assessment level, it's almost impossible to catch unless you're looking for it specifically. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard 6 months ago, the one about the compromised foundation that nobody needed to know about. What if there's more? What if the developments themselves are also fraudulent? Professor Chen leaned back in her chair. Then you're not just talking about assessment fraud, you're talking about construction fraud, code violations, potentially criminal negligence if any of those buildings have safety issues. That's FBI territory, not just state's attorney. That's people going to prison. The room felt smaller suddenly. This had started as a way to understand why William valued me at $900 a month. Now I was sitting across from a former prosecutor talking about federal crimes. I need to be very clear with you. If you're planning to pursue this, you need to understand what you're getting into. Your father is a prominent developer with a lot of connections in this city. The kind of investigation you're suggesting would require subpoenas, forensic accounting, probably cooperation from several different agencies. It's not something you can do on your own. So what should I do? Honestly, nothing. Walk away. You've had a falling out with your family. That's unfortunate, but it happens. Don't let it turn into something that destroys your entire life. Your father has resources you don't. If he realizes you're investigating him, he can make your life very difficult. I should have listened to her. A saner person would have, but sanity had been in short supply lately, and the idea of walking away, of letting William continue to operate like the rules didn't apply to him, made me physically ill. What if I'm not doing it on my own? I asked. What if I brought in someone with actual authority? She studied me for a long moment. Then she pulled out a business card from her desk drawer and slid it across to me. This is Special Agent Marcus Webb. He's with the FBI's white-collar crime division here in Chicago. We worked together when I was at the state's attorney's office. He's good, and more importantly, he's not afraid of going after prominent people if the evidence supports it. I took the card. It felt heavier than it should have. If I contact him, there's no going back, is there? No, there isn't. So you need to be absolutely sure this is what you want. Not revenge, not vindication, not proving something to your father. Justice. Real, legal justice, even if it means your family implodes in the process. Can you live with that? I thought about John's BMW, about Victoria's silence, about William looking at me across a table covered in Belgian linens and Hermes china and telling me I wasn't worth keeping around for free. About 21 years of being the daughter who was never quite enough, never quite right, never quite as valuable as my brother. Yes, I said, I can live with that. I called Agent Webb from the street outside DePaul, standing in the cold while students rushed past me toward their next classes. He answered on the third ring, his voice professionally neutral. I explained who I was, that Professor Chen had given me his number, that I had information about potential real estate fraud in Chicago. He agreed to meet me the next morning at the FBI's field office on West Roosevelt. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what Professor Chen had said, about how there was no going back once I made this official. Part of me wanted to delete everything, pretend I'd never gone down this rabbit hole, maybe even call Victoria and negotiate some kind of truce. But every time I reached for my phone to do it, I'd remember William's face at dinner, the casual certainty with which he'd delivered his verdict on my worth, the way he'd looked at John with pride he'd never shown me. No, I wasn't backing down. Not this time. The FBI's Chicago field office was less dramatic than I'd expected from movies. Just a regular building with extra security and a lot of people in business casual carrying coffee. Agent Webb met me in a conference room on the third floor. He was younger than I'd pictured, maybe 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of neat appearance that suggested he'd been military at some point. "Miss Dalton," he said, shaking my hand, "Sarah Chen speaks highly of you. She said you might have information relevant to our jurisdiction." I'd brought my laptop and a printed copy of my spreadsheet. For the next 2 hours, I walked him through everything I'd found. The shell companies, the rapid transfers, the suspicious property assessments. He took notes, asked detailed questions about dates and amounts, and maintained an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. When I finished, he sat back and removed his glasses to clean them. This is thorough work, more thorough than most tips we get, honestly. You've clearly put a lot of effort into this. So you'll investigate? I'll run it by my supervisor. If what you're suggesting is accurate, it's definitely within our jurisdiction. Bank fraud, wire fraud, potentially RICO charges if there's an organized pattern of criminal activity. But I need to be straight with you about something. Okay? Cases like this take time. Months, sometimes years. We'd need to subpoena bank records, property records, interview appraisers and loan officers, potentially flip some of the people involved to testify against others. It's not fast, and it's not certain. Your father would have access to expensive lawyers who'd fight every step. Even if we build a case, there's no guarantee we'd get a conviction. But you'd try? If the evidence supports it, yes, we'd try. He closed my folder and slid it back across the table. But I need you to understand something else. The moment we start issuing subpoenas, your father will know someone's investigating him. And if he's as smart as his reputation suggests, he'll figure out it's you. Are you prepared for that? For him to know you're the reason his entire business is under federal scrutiny? I thought about my new apartment in Logan Square, about Melissa and Rachel and Ashley, and their easy acceptance, about the gallery internship I'd hated but stayed with because William had told me to, about the person I'd been 24 hours ago, trying so desperately to earn approval that was never going to come. "Yes," I said, "I'm prepared." Agent Webb stood up and extended his hand again. "Then we'll be in touch. Might take a couple weeks to get things moving, but I'll keep you updated. And, Miss Dalton, be careful. If your father is involved in what you think he is, and if he realizes you're the source of our investigation, he could make things difficult for you. Watch your back." I left the FBI building feeling both lighter and heavier than when I'd arrived. I'd done it. I'd actually done it. Whatever happened next, at least I'd tried to hold William accountable for something. That had to count for something. My phone rang while I was walking to the train. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Jenny, it's Stuart, your father's attorney. We really need to talk." "I don't think we do." "Jenny, please, just hear me out. Your father is willing to apologize. He recognizes that his comments at dinner were inappropriate and hurtful. He'd like to invite you to lunch this week to discuss how we can resolve the situation amicably." The careful lawyer language was almost funny. Inappropriate and hurtful. Not wrong or cruel or evidence of systemic favoritism that's defined your entire relationship. Inappropriate and hurtful. Like he'd used the wrong fork at dinner. "Tell my father I'm not interested in his apology. He's prepared to waive the rent requirement. You can continue living at the penthouse rent-free just like before. And he'd like to discuss other arrangements that might make you more comfortable." Translation, he was offering to buy my silence. The penthouse, probably some kind of allowance, maybe even a real paid position somewhere. All I had to do was come back, smile for photos, and pretend none of this had happened. It was a good offer, objectively. Most people in my position would have taken it. "I'm going to say this once, so please write it down," I said. "I don't want my father's money. I don't want his apology. I don't want anything from him except to never have to see him again. Are we clear?" There was a long pause. "Jenny, I understand you're upset, but you're making decisions that will have long-term consequences. Your father is a powerful man in this city. You don't want him as an enemy." Too late. He made me an enemy when he told me I wasn't worth what he spent on my brother's car payment. Tell him I said thanks for the motivation. I hung up and immediately blocked the number. Then I blocked every other number that had tried to reach me from William's circle. If they wanted to talk, they could send a carrier pigeon. 2 weeks passed before I heard from Agent Webb again. 2 weeks of settling into my new life, of learning how to grocery shop on a budget, of taking actual paid shifts at a coffee shop in Wicker Park because $450 a month plus utilities wasn't going to pay itself. Melissa kept asking if I'd heard anything, and I kept saying no, and part of me started to wonder if the FBI had looked at my evidence and decided it wasn't worth pursuing. Maybe William's reputation was too solid. Maybe I'd imagined patterns that weren't really there. Maybe I was just a bitter daughter looking for revenge and calling it justice. Then Agent Webb called. "Ms. Dalton, we need to meet. Same place as before, but bring everything you have. Documents, emails, anything you might have overheard or seen. We're moving forward with the investigation." The next morning, I found myself back in that conference room. But this time, Agent Webb had brought colleagues. A forensic accountant named Patricia, who looked like she could find a missing penny in the national budget. A senior agent named Collins, who had the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen every variation of white-collar crime humanity could devise. and a woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office named Jennifer Kim, who took notes on everything and occasionally asked questions that made me realize exactly how serious this had become. "We've subpoenaed records from 3 banks your father's company works with," Agent Webb explained, spreading documents across the table. "The pattern you identified? It's even more extensive than you thought. We're looking at potentially 47 properties over 8 years, not just the 23 you found. The shell companies are more complex, too. There's a whole network of LLCs, most of them registered in Delaware, all ultimately controlled by your father and business partner, Richard Chen." "Richard Chen?" I asked. "Is he related to Professor Chen?" "Her brother, actually, which is how she recognized some of the property addresses when you first contacted her. She'd heard Richard mention them at family dinners, but never put the pieces together. She's cooperating fully now." The irony was almost funny. I'd gone to Professor Chen by chance, and it turned out her brother was one of William's co-conspirators. The universe had a dark sense of humor. Patricia, the forensic accountant, pulled up a chart on her laptop. "Here's what we think is happening. Your father buys a property through Dalton Development. Let's say it's worth $2 million. He immediately transfers it to one of these shell companies for the same price. Then, over the next few months, the shell company submits fraudulent comparables to the county assessor, claiming the property is actually worth $6 million. The assessment gets approved because Richard Chen has been paying off an assessor named Thomas Brandt for the last 6 years. We have Brandt's bank records," Agent Webb added. "Regular deposits from accounts linked to the shell companies. 20,000 here, 30,000 there. Not enough to trigger automatic scrutiny, but consistent. He was making more from bribes than his county salary. Once the inflated assessment is official," Patricia continued, "the property transfers back to Dalton Development, now officially valued at $6 million. Your father takes out construction loans based on that inflated value. The banks approve because the assessment looks legitimate. He pockets the extra $4 million in loan money, develops the property cheaply, then sells it at actual market value and pays back the loans with interest. The banks think everything's fine because they got their money back. They don't realize the original loan was based on fraud." I felt sick. How much money are we talking about? Conservatively, about $80 million over 8 years. But here's where it gets worse. She pulled up another document. Some of these developments were done with substandard materials and cut corners. That conversation you overheard about the compromised foundation? We found the building. It's a residential complex in Pilsen with 43 units. The foundation is actively settling. The building is structurally unsound. Your father knew this and sold it anyway. "People are living there right now," Jennifer Kim said quietly. "Families, children, in a building that could have serious structural failure." The conference room felt too small suddenly. This wasn't just financial fraud anymore. This was lives at risk. Real people who'd bought homes thinking they were safe, trusting that the developer had followed the rules, that the inspections meant something. "We need your testimony," Agent Webb said. "Everything you overheard, everything you noticed growing up, the late-night meetings, the conversations that stopped when you entered rooms, the way your father operated, it's all relevant." "When?" "Soon. We're preparing to execute search warrants on Dalton Development's offices, your father's home office, and the shell company addresses. Once we do that, everything moves quickly. Your father will lawyer up immediately. There'll be media coverage. Your family will know it's you who started this. Are you still prepared for that?" I thought about the residents in that Pilsen building, going about their lives with no idea their home was slowly collapsing beneath them. I thought about how many other buildings William had cut corners on, how many other families he'd put at risk for money he didn't even need. "I'm prepared," I said. The search warrants were executed on a Thursday morning. I know because Melissa woke me up by shoving her phone in my face, which was showing a news alert. FBI raids prominent Chicago developer's office in fraud investigation. There was a photo of agents carrying boxes out of Dalton Development's Michigan Avenue offices. Another photo showed William being escorted to a car, his face frozen in an expression I'd never seen before. Fear. My phone started ringing immediately. I'd changed my number, but somehow they'd found it anyway. Reporters mostly, asking for comments. A few family friends who'd apparently decided I was worthy of their attention now that I was at the center of a scandal. Even Victoria's sister Catherine called, not to check on me, but to scream about how I was destroying the family. I ignored all of them except one. John. "Jenny, what the hell did you do?" His voice was shaking. "The FBI is at the house. They're going through everything. Dad's lawyer says we're all under investigation. Mom won't stop crying. What did you do?" I told the truth. "About what? About some family argument? Jesus Christ, Jenny, this is insane. They're talking about prison. Federal prison. Do you understand what you've done?" I understand that Dad's been committing fraud for years. I understand that he's put people's lives at risk. I understand that he values money more than human safety. Yeah, John, I understand exactly what I've done. This is because of the rent thing, isn't it? Because Dad asked you to pay rent and you threw a tantrum. You're destroying our entire family over $900 a month. The laugh that came out of me was harsh enough that Melissa looked up from her coffee with concern. "You still don't get it. This isn't about the rent. The rent was just the moment I realized that Dad sees me as a transaction." "That you both do. That I've spent my entire life trying to earn something you were born with, and it was never going to happen. So yeah, when I found out Dad was also treating the law as optional, I decided someone should hold him accountable." "He gave you everything," John said, his voice rising. "He paid for your school, your clothes, your car before you sold it. He gave you a life most people would kill for, and this is how you repay him?" "He gave me conditionally, John. Every gift came with strings. Every kindness was actually a debt I was supposed to repay with gratitude and obedience. And when I stopped being useful, he charged me rent in my own home while buying you a BMW. So no, I don't think I owe him anything." "The internship at Goldman is gone," John said quietly. "They called this morning, said they're rescinding the offer due to reputational concerns. My entire career is destroyed before it even started, and it's your fault." I should have felt guilty. A better person would have. But all I felt was tired. Your entire career was built on Dad's fraud money and his connections. Maybe it's time you earned something on your own. He hung up. I blocked his number too. The media coverage was intense. Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story, "Chicago Gold Coast developer accused of massive fraud scheme." The Sun-Times went with, "Luxury developer's house of cards collapses." Local news stations camped outside the penthouse, outside Dalton Development's offices, even outside my apartment in Logan Square once they figured out where I was living. Melissa had to chase a reporter off our front steps with a broom. But it was the follow-up stories that really hit. A week after the raids, the Tribune published an investigation into the Pilsen building with the compromised foundation. They interviewed residents who'd noticed cracks in their walls, doors that wouldn't close properly, floors that had developed a slant. One woman, Maria Gonzalez, had complained to building management 6 times about structural issues. She'd been ignored every time. Now she was living in a hotel with her 2 kids, while the city declared the building uninhabitable. The story included a quote from William's lawyer. "Mr. Dalton maintains his innocence and looks forward to clearing his name in court. These allegations are baseless and appear to be motivated by a family dispute." A family dispute. He was framing 43 families being displaced from their homes as a family dispute. Agent Webb called me that afternoon. "Have you seen the news?" Hard to miss it. The Pilsen building is our strongest case. We have the original inspection reports that show the foundation issues. We have internal emails from Dalton Development discussing whether to disclose the problems. And we have your testimony about the conversation you overheard. Combined with the financial fraud, we're looking at multiple federal charges. When's the arraignment? Tomorrow. Your father's been released on bond, but there are conditions. He can't leave Illinois, he had to surrender his passport, and he's under house arrest with an ankle monitor. His lawyer is already trying to get that changed, but it won't happen before the arraignment. Will I have to be there? Not yet. That comes later at trial. But Jenny, I need you to be ready. Your father's lawyer is going to come after you hard. They're going to paint you as a vindictive daughter who made up allegations because of a personal grudge. They're going to dig into your life, your finances, your relationships. They're going to try to destroy your credibility. Let them try. But that night, lying in my sunroom bedroom, listening to the radiator clank, I wasn't as confident as I'd sounded. Agent Webb was right. William had resources I couldn't match. He had lawyers who charged $1,000 an hour. He had connections throughout Chicago's legal system. He had a reputation built over 30 years. What did I have? A spreadsheet and some overheard conversations? Melissa knocked on my door around midnight. You still awake? Yeah. She came in and sat on the edge of my air mattress. Rachel's boyfriend works at the Tribune. He says their investigative team is looking into your dad's other properties now. They're finding more issues. Buildings with electrical problems that weren't up to code, HVAC systems that were installed wrong. One apartment building in Bronzeville had pipes that burst last winter because they weren't properly insulated. The residents had no heat for 2 weeks in January. Jesus. It gets worse. They're finding a pattern. Every building where your dad cut corners was in a neighborhood that's predominantly Black or Latino. The luxury developments he did in Lincoln Park and Gold Coast, those were all up to code. Perfect inspections. But the affordable housing developments he did with city subsidies, those are the ones with problems. He was literally building safe homes for rich white people and death traps for everyone else. I hadn't even considered that angle. But of course William would see poor residents and residents of color as less deserving of safety. Of course he'd reserve his actual effort for people who looked like him and had money like him. The man who'd told me I wasn't worth a BMW built entire communities around the idea that some people mattered less than others. The Tribune wants to interview you, Melissa said. Rachel's boyfriend said they'd treat you fairly, let you tell your side of the story. Agent Webb said not to talk to media. He said not to talk about the case. This would be about your family, about why you came forward. It's different. I thought about Maria Gonzalez and her 2 kids in a hotel room, about all the other families displaced because William had decided their safety was negotiable, about the bigger story that needed to be told, the one about developers who saw affordable housing as an opportunity to cut corners and maximize profit. Set it up, I said. The Tribune interview ran the following Sunday, front page of the Metro section. Developer's daughter speaks. He taught me to value profit over people. They'd taken a photo of me in my Logan Square apartment, sitting at the scratched IKEA table, looking tired but determined. I'd told them everything. The birthday dinner, the rent demand, the BMW for John, the years of being treated as less valuable than my brother, and finally, the overheard conversation that had started me digging. The reporter, a woman named Sarah Klein, had done her job well. She'd connected my personal story to the bigger pattern. Jenny Dalton's experience as a daughter deemed unworthy mirrors her father's approach to development. Some people matter, some don't. Some people deserve safety and quality, others don't. The same mindset that led William Dalton to charge his daughter rent while gifting his son a luxury car led him to build substandard housing for low-income families while reserving his best work for wealthy neighborhoods. The article went viral. By Monday morning, it had been shared 50,000 times on social media. Other news outlets picked it up. CNN called. So did Good Morning America. The story had evolved beyond local corruption into something bigger, a story about inequality, about who gets protected and who gets exploited, about a young woman who'd decided that justice mattered more than family loyalty. William's lawyer issued a statement calling the article a one-sided hit piece based on the unsubstantiated claims of a troubled young woman. But it was too late. The court of public opinion had made its verdict. 3 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse watching William take a plea deal. His lawyers had fought hard, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, emails, testimony from Thomas Brandt, the corrupt assessor who'd flipped in exchange for a reduced sentence, testimony from construction workers who'd been told to use cheaper materials, and inspection reports that had been falsified. The FBI had built an airtight case. William pleaded guilty to bank fraud, wire fraud, and criminal negligence. The prosecution recommended 15 years in federal prison. The judge would make the final decision at sentencing, but Agent Webb had told me the recommendation would likely be followed. I watched my father stand before the judge, looking smaller somehow, his expensive suit hanging differently on his frame. Victoria sat in the gallery, her face composed but pale. John was next to her, staring straight ahead. Neither of them looked at me. The judge asked William if he understood the charges and the plea agreement. William said yes, his voice steady. Then she asked if he had anything to say before she accepted the plea. "I take full responsibility for my actions," William said, reading from a prepared statement. "I made serious mistakes in my business practices, and I deeply regret the harm caused to the families affected by those mistakes. I hope that by accepting this plea, I can begin to make amends." It was a carefully worded non-apology, written by lawyers to minimize his legal exposure. No admission of intent, no acknowledgement of the years of deliberate fraud, just mistakes and regrets. The judge wasn't buying it. "Mr. Dalton, you didn't make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to defraud banks. You chose to bribe officials. You chose to build unsafe housing for families who trusted you. And you made those choices over and over again for nearly a decade. These weren't errors in judgment. This was a systematic pattern of criminal behavior motivated by greed." She accepted the plea, but indicated she was considering a sentence at the higher end of the guidelines. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. I left the courthouse through a side entrance to avoid reporters. Agent Webb walked me to my car, a used Honda Civic I'd bought with money from the coffee shop job. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know. I thought I'd feel something. Relief, maybe, or vindication, but I just feel empty." "That's normal. You did the right thing, but that doesn't mean it doesn't cost you something. You lost your family today." "I lost them a long time ago. Today, I just made it official." He nodded. "For what it's worth, you should be proud. The Pilsen families are getting restitution. The city is conducting safety inspections on all of your father's properties. Building codes are being strengthened. You changed things." "Maybe. But I'd also destroyed my family, cost my brother his career, and ensured that I'd spend the rest of my life as that woman who turned in her own father. There was no going back from this. No Christmas dinners, no family photos, no possibility of reconciliation. I'd traded everything I'd known for justice, and I wasn't sure yet if the exchange had been worth it. But then I thought about Maria Gonzalez and her kids, now living in a safe apartment with rent being paid from the restitution fund. I thought about all the other families who wouldn't have to worry about their floors collapsing or their walls cracking. I thought about future families who'd be protected by stronger building codes and more rigorous inspections. Maybe that had to be enough. I drove back to Logan Square, back to my sunroom bedroom with the temperamental radiator and the view of a brick wall instead of Lake Michigan. Melissa had left a note on the kitchen table. "Proud of you. Wine in the fridge." I poured myself a glass and sat at the IKEA table, where this had all started 3 months ago. My laptop was still there, still open to the spreadsheet that had changed everything. I'd closed it finally. I didn't need it anymore. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it, but curiosity won. This is Victoria. Your father's sentencing is in 6 weeks. If you could find it in your heart to write a letter to the judge on his behalf, it might help reduce his sentence. He's still your father. Please think about it. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to laugh at the audacity. After everything, she thought I'd help him? That I'd write to a judge and ask for mercy for a man who'd shown none to me or to the families he'd endangered? But another part of me, the part that was still William's daughter despite everything, felt a pull. He was still my father. He'd raised me, taught me to ride a bike, came to some of my school plays. There had been good moments mixed in with the bad. Did those count for nothing? I thought about what he'd taught me, really taught me, that some people mattered more than others, that money was more important than safety, that the rules were for other people, that daughters were worth less than sons, that power meant never having to be accountable. No, those lessons didn't deserve mercy. I deleted the message and blocked Victoria's number. 6 weeks later, William was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The judge cited the extensive nature of the fraud, the number of families affected, and a complete lack of genuine remorse in her decision. With good behavior, he'd be eligible for release in 15 years. He'd be 74 years old. I didn't attend the sentencing. I was at work, pulling espresso shots at the coffee shop when Melissa texted me the news. I finished my shift, went home, and slept for 12 hours straight. When I woke, I had an email from Professor Chen. She'd been following the case and wanted me to know that she was proud of what I'd done. She also had an offer, a research assistant position at DePaul, paid, working on a project about real estate fraud and affordable housing. It wasn't much money, but it was real experience in a field I was starting to care about. I accepted immediately. 3 months turned into 6, then a year. I finished my research assistantship and got accepted into DePaul's law school with a scholarship focused on housing advocacy. Melissa and I moved into a bigger apartment, still in Logan Square, with an actual bedroom instead of a sunroom. I quit the coffee shop and started an internship with a nonprofit that helped low-income residents fight slumlords and developers. I didn't hear from John or Victoria. I'd Google them occasionally, in weak moments. John had eventually found a job at a smaller financial firm, nothing like Goldman, but respectable. Victoria had sold the penthouse and moved to a condo in Streeterville, something smaller and more manageable. They'd both given interviews painting themselves as victims of my vendetta, which stung but didn't surprise me. William sent me a letter from prison once. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won again. It was short, written in his precise handwriting on prison stationery. Jennifer, I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. I understand now that I failed you as a father. I put money and status ahead of family, and I paid the price. I hope someday you can forgive me. Your father, William. It was the closest he'd ever come to an actual apology, and it still wasn't quite there. I failed you, not I was wrong. I put money ahead of family, not I committed crimes. Even from prison, even after losing everything, he couldn't quite admit the full truth of what he'd done. I didn't write back. 2 years after the sentencing, I ran into John at a Starbucks in the Loop. I almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight, looked tired, wearing a suit that was nice, but not Brunello Cucinelli nice. He was standing in line ahead of me, and I could have left, but something made me stay. When he turned around with his coffee, he saw me. We stared at each other for a long moment. "Jenny," he said finally. "John, you look good. Different, but good." "Thanks, you too." Another pause. The Starbucks was crowded, people pushing past us, but we stood there in our little bubble of awkward family history. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for what I said on the phone about it being your fault. I was angry, but that wasn't fair. You were right, about Dad, about all of it." I hadn't expected that. What changed your mind? Therapy, mostly, and seeing how people at work treated me once they knew who my father was, like I was complicit just by association. It made me understand what you went through your whole life, always being judged as less than. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. It was the apology I'd needed from William but had never gotten. Getting it from John instead felt both wrong and right at the same time. I appreciate that. How's Mom? She's okay, still not ready to talk about everything. She asks about you sometimes, though. Tell her I'm doing well. Tell her I'm in law school, working on housing advocacy. Tell her that what happened needed to happen. She knows. I think she's always known. She just can't admit it yet. We exchanged numbers, promised to maybe get coffee sometime, both knowing we probably wouldn't, but needing to make the gesture anyway. As I watched him leave, I realized I didn't hate him anymore. He'd been a product of the same toxic system I had, just positioned differently within it. He'd gotten the privileges I'd been denied, but he'd also been shaped by William's values in ways that ultimately hurt him too. Maybe someday we'd actually have that coffee. Maybe not. Either way, I was okay with it. I graduated from DePaul Law 3 years after William went to prison. Professor Chen was at the ceremony, along with Melissa and Rachel and Ashley. Agent Webb sent flowers with a note that said, "You changed more than you know." And sitting in the back, wearing sunglasses even though we were indoors, was Victoria. She didn't come to the reception afterward, but she sent me a text later that night. "I'm proud of you. I'm sorry I couldn't say it in person. I'm not ready yet, but I wanted you to know." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was something. An acknowledgement that I'd done what she couldn't, that I'd stood up when she'd stayed silent, that sometimes breaking a family apart is the only way to save the people in it. I texted back, "Thank you. Take your time. I'll be here when you're ready." 6 months later, I accepted a job with Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, working on a fair housing initiative. My first case involved a developer who'd been cutting corners on affordable housing using substandard materials and falsifying inspections. The pattern was familiar. When we won and the developer was forced to pay millions in restitution and retrofitting costs, I thought about William. He'd taught me exactly what I needed to know to fight people like him. He'd shown me how the fraud worked, how developers exploited poor communities, how money and connections could insulate you from consequences until someone cared enough to dig deeper. He'd given me a masterclass in corruption, and I'd used it to become the thing he feared most, someone who wouldn't look away. That night, I wrote him a letter, the first and only one I'd send. "William, you taught me my most valuable lesson on my 21st birthday. You taught me what I was worth to you, $900 a month. But you were wrong about what that number meant. You thought it proved I was worthless. What it actually proved was that your values were corrupted, that you'd lost the ability to see people as anything other than transactions, that you measured worth in dollars instead of human dignity. Today, I won a case that will provide safe housing for 200 families. I'm making $45,000 a year, barely enough to cover my loans and rent. But I'm doing more good in the world than you ever did with all your millions. So thank you for teaching me that lesson. Thank you for showing me exactly the kind of person I never wanted to become. Your daughter, Jenny." I mailed it and never checked if he responded. It didn't matter. The letter was for me, not him. 5 years after that birthday dinner, I got word that William had died in prison. Heart attack. Sudden. Nobody's fault. He was 68, 3 years into his sentence. John called to tell me, his voice carefully neutral, asking if I wanted to attend the funeral. I thought about it for a long time, about closure and forgiveness and family obligations, about the good memories mixed in with the bad ones, about the father he'd been before the father he'd become. In the end, I didn't go. But I did sit in my apartment that day, the one I'd bought with money I'd earned myself, in a neighborhood I'd chosen, surrounded by furniture I'd picked out, and I cried. Not for the man who'd told me I wasn't worth it, but for the father I'd wished he could have been. For the family we might have had if he'd chosen love over money, connection over control, humanity over profit. I cried for what could have been, accepted what was, and then I got up and went to work. There were families who needed advocates, developers who needed to be held accountable, systems that needed to be changed. Because that's what William had really taught me in the end, that justice doesn't come from waiting for powerful people to do the right thing. It comes from someone deciding that enough is enough, that some lines can't be crossed without consequences, that accountability matters more than comfort. He'd taught me that by showing me exactly what happens when no one holds you accountable. And I'd learned the lesson so well that I'd held him accountable for everything. The moral wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Rich people don't get to buy their way out of consequences. Fathers don't get to value sons over daughters without cost. Developers don't get to endanger lives for profit. And sometimes, the daughter you underestimate is the one who brings your empire crashing down. I was worth more than $900 a month. I was worth enough to fight for justice even when it cost me everything. I was worth enough to rebuild a life from scratch. I was worth enough to change a broken system, one case at a time. William had been wrong about a lot of things, but he was especially wrong about me. And in the end, that made all the difference.